Good morning, everybody. My name is Tendai Murisa. I don't think I need more introduction beyond that. So we are building upon the framing that we've been given by Brian around capital, framing capital from a perspective of understanding power and also looking at capital as of now. Not in it, yes, the history matters, but as of now, the shifts, the challenges we face, the moment we are in, the urgency and the uncertainty that we have to deal with, the excitement and the hope that we have with the disruptions that are opening globally. Like Brian has already said, that you can look at this as an opportunity for us to begin to claim our position as Africans. So we're going to be exploring these discussions, and also for many of us who are used to a certain model, a certain framework of funding, it could also be a moment of despair, given the number of nonprofits that we have seen collapse and the challenges with development projects across the board. So I'll be doing less of speaking today because we've got a panel of experts that are going to lead us to today. And I don't want to, just to calm them, I'll just say grab the mic, introduce yourself, tell them what you do, then we'll get into the work. I'll start with you, Kadi.
I don't know, is this on? Yeah, it's on. Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Kadi Silla. I serve as the Director for Africa and the Middle East at Mirrored USA. We're based in New York City. We're a public charity, and we facilitate cross-border giving across the world, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and beyond. And my role is predominantly working with individual donors that have interest in the regions that I oversee, as well as serve as a partnership lead alongside my colleague Habi, who's in this room, to support the nonprofit, African-led nonprofits that are fundraising in the US, as well as nonprofits in the Middle East. So I'll stop there.
My name is Stephen Beck. I'm the president and founder of the New Africa Fund. We are a US charity, and we work exclusively with small, local NGOs, CBOs, and more social enterprises. We provide unrestricted funding and, more importantly, training in fundraising through matching grants, fiscal sponsorship, and other tools to allow local organizations to unlock local funding, dollar for dollar. In addition, we have an impact investment fund that provides recoverable grants and low-interest loans for projects like affordable housing. In Kenya and Rwanda, we work in about 18 different countries, and I'll stop there.
Sure. Over to you, Sam.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Mugasha with Imaginable Futures. Imaginable Futures is a philanthropic investment firm. We support education in Kenya, and we have been investing in the continent for the past 10, 15 years. And buzzword alert, we believe in systems change. So that is what we support, and we help catalyze and unlock opportunities for young people on the continent. Thank you.
Good morning. I must own my names. I am Brigadier Briggs Bomba. I serve as the Director of Programs for Trust Africa. That's one hat, of course. We are a Pan-African foundation headquartered in Dakar, Senegal. Buzzword alert. We are focused on strengthening African agency in solving the continent's most pressing challenges. We work on democracy and governance, equitable development, African philanthropy, and I look forward to talking more about African agency. Thank you.
Thanks, Briggs. I think you are one of the last ones, the comrades on the continent. So to kick us off, just the framing, the data is showing us that remittances have overtaken ODA. These are diaspora funds that Brian was making reference to. And this could be read in two ways. Is that liberation from conditional funding, or there's a new dependency around volatile money, informal inflows that replace predictable institutional money? From your seat, what are we talking about? I'll start with Kadi. You facilitate $195 million to over 1,000 nonprofits every year, last year alone. So from inside the cross-border plumbing, has the composition of who gives actually changed? Is there more diaspora and high net worth individuals in the mix? Who are these people? Are there fewer institutions? And does that change what a receiving organization has to be capable of?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm actually glad we start with that because, yes, Mirrored USA as a global entity in cross-border giving did give $195 million. But the majority of that money went to Europe. If you were to break it down, and if you go on our website, you'll see where money flows. $137 million of the 195 went to Europe. Africa and the Middle East combined received $30 million. Now that's a huge progress in terms of where things were before I started at the foundation about 5 years ago. Prior to my start, we were facilitating roughly about $6 million to Africa. So now it's $30 million, so that's progress. But personally, I'm not happy with that. It doesn't make sense to me that, yes, Europe has older institutions and a lot of donors that we work with are indeed interested in like arts and culture, education, infrastructure on the continent of Europe. That's great. But it takes about 10 grants for one European institution to receive that same money. So $5 million for one institution in Europe. Africa and Middle East is about 10 organizations. All that to say that the composition of the funders have not changed. We predominantly work with individual donors, and I think we'll continue to do that. But the degree and the flow of money is still much more challenging to convince individual donors across the broader sector in America to fund African-led entities. And that's our priority. We are there to support African-led organizations. We work with donors that are interested in that. And it's quite a constant battle to make the case constantly for that. But I'm happy that the money is going up and we'll continue to do that. But the $195 million, $30 million for Africa and the Middle East was not something that easily came through.
To stand up. So, Kadi, I want just to press a bit. So you're saying 130 million is coming from the USA, going to Europe, from one developed region to another developed region. Just explain to us that. What does that mean and what does that look like?
I mean, these are typically donors. Again, keep in mind that we're working mostly with individual donors. We work with some foundations, but the majority of our donors, I would say about 90% of the portfolios are individuals. These are donors that typically fund based on familiarity, right? Like it's much easier for them to fund an art institution or university in France, either because they've studied there or they went on vacation. Same thing with Italy. The same thing cannot be said about Africa. A lot of the organizations, a lot of the donors that we work with have a level of familiarity with Africa that is completely different from the same donor that's interested in Europe. Family is their relations. In Africa, it's often one visit maybe, right? And it's usually associated with safari, or it's because they've done what's that development program that many people did in the 80s, overseas studies or overseas development agency. And so a lot of the donors that we work with have had some sort of relation with Africa or African communities through Teach America, for example, right? Those kind of programs, and they want to continue to be connected to those communities. It's a different degree of relationship, I want to say.
It's a very interesting development because we've always assumed that Africa is the recipient of aid, but now we're beginning to realize all these flows of our money flows. Stephen, back to you. In your work, you meet capital at the moment it lands on an organization. These new flows that we're discussing, are they visible at ground level? Are we seeing nothing? Are we seeing anything that is changing? The grant cycle of CBOs that you fund, actually, is that changed? What's tangibly different currently, what you are seeing as you're working across the countries you made reference to?
So, thank you. I think the most amazing thing that I've seen just in the last year and a half, that we've had a program that has been trying to encourage small CBOs and NGOs to diversify their funding, is 3,000, I checked the numbers this morning, 3,125 donors have come through our system to give to these 100+ organizations. with an average donation of $37, and 70% of them have been from addresses in the continent: Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Rwanda, Tanzania. We provide the infrastructure. They reach into their local communities, their diaspora communities, and they have been bringing in these funds. It is a marriage of advances in technology, where they are not cheap, but they exist, where funds can come from abroad into the continent, cross borders. There is a plethora of apps that now allow people to send mobile money to each other, regardless of where they are. And this has really helped them unlock funding that they didn't know existed. We give them the tools, we give them the motivation through a match, but they reach into their communities and they have to convince their communities to give $5 or $5 a month, and it's working. That 3,000 donors, and 70% of them are living in the continent, and a whole lot of them have names that are more similar to yours than mine. They are reaching into their diaspora.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Sam, I imagine there'll be futures. I think the future has arrived, right? Around catalytic capital. So the assumptions around small amounts of money that are risk tolerant, with the hypothesis that they will unlock larger capital, larger flows of capital. But now with these disruptions that Kadi and others are talking about, what Brian is making reference to, are remittances and HNWI wealth, high net worth individuals, are they amenable to the work that you've been doing? Can we unlock these the way you've been looking at unlocking institutional capital? And does this catalytic thesis still hold for us as we're thinking about sort of the space that you're working in? What are you trying to catalyze now? So many questions.
Thank you so much. I think the radical idea here is that we have imported structures and models that do not replicate here. And the reason is, when you think about remittances and all of these, they are relationship-based, they are family-based, and they are community-based. So they will fund their child, they will fund their cousin, their nephews, their communities, but they will not come in that, what you would define, institution or foundation. So I think what we've not done a good job of is trying to, as Brian was saying, understand that and then be able to catalyze that. And I think for us as our organization, what we've tried to do is support community ownership and contribution. That at that foundational level, at that grassroots level, does the community believe in what you want to do? Does the community own and actually contribute to that theory of change that you made in the boardroom, so that they can be able to actually own that impact and transformation at that grassroots level?
Okay, I want to stay with you for a bit. I'll come to you, Kadi. Brian made references to these indigenous collective pools, Harambes, Stokvels, etc. Is this an area you are active in? Do you look at that as catalytic capital at all?
So, if we define as Harambe, Chamas, that almost puts us in a specific structure. We define it as community contribution. It can be land, it can be whatever, it can even be labor. It can also be all that chamas and everything.
Fantastic.
But we count that and we say that the community has actually contributed.
Okay. Brigadier, Kadi, I'll come to you. Brigadier, we just want to, we've all celebrated Trust Africa, its emergence. And this year, I believe Trust Africa is turning 20th anniversary. And we've watched this from a Pan-African seat for 20 years. So are there genuine new shifts that you are seeing, or it's just a recurring cycle? It's just a bubble, it just like comes up and go back to regular settings? The aid retreats, new instruments arriving, underlying architecture. What is structurally different about this time from where you sit?
Thanks, Murisa. I think let me start by contributing to a perspective and answer the question that Evans posed. Will our dreams survive? If ULET was to disappear, OSF, Ford, a lot of names that we can name in this room. And I think the best way to look at it is to bring in the figures. The development financing need annually on the continent is about $1.3 trillion. If you then look at the flows of development finance into the continent, I know the note from EAPN is saying diaspora financing is $54 billion. It's actually about $100 billion if you look at the whole continent, and it's been consistent at that figure. It's more than FDI and ODA. FDI is comparable, almost about the same. ODA, almost about half of that. If you then go to philanthropy, which is the institutions we have named, and some even like us, out of the $1.3 trillion, philanthropy is bringing in 4.5 to a maximum $6 billion. You can do the statistics there. It's an extremely limited figure when you look at the full matrix of development financing. So we are already surviving. There are things that are already happening, but I'll say something that will shock you. African governments, through domestic resource mobilization, are mobilizing between $600 billion to $630 billion annually towards financing for development. A fact that is hidden in that statement is that it's 40% of your monthly salary that is going into the domestic resource mobilization figure. So if you want to really ask the question of who is giving more, who is contributing more to development financing on the continent, it's actually us. When I say 40%, it's more of the African elite, whom I assume are the people that I'm sitting at here, because they're 5%, 10%, income tax brackets, but I think most of us are in that 40%. We are already giving very significantly, and it's the $600 to $630 billion that African governments are raising annually, contributing towards this. So I think when we look at ourselves as philanthropy and when we engage this question, we need to have that perspective so that we really look at, and I think Brian spoke about earlier, the question of, whilst it's a small figure, there's a way in which it can be very strategically deployed and strategically leveraged to have an oversized impact, especially when it goes into these blended financing mechanisms where you are reducing risk, you are underwriting risk, and you are really combining with ODA, encouraging private sector to invest in things that they would naturally not invest. So that's the first point, summaries. The second point, it's true that we are in a moment of transition and we are seeing major, major shifts. So if you look at ODA, for example, it's been going down in a very significant manner. And if you look at bilateral assistance and funding, the language itself has actually shifted. They are now talking of moving from aid to trade. Those are the buzzwords. And they're also even talking about localization. And for the most part, when they talk about localization, they're actually talking about skipping the layer that is represented in this room. You now have FCDO or even the European Union wanting to go directly to that last mile actor and engage with them. And there are fundamental questions there to say, if they gave you trauma with the capacity that you have to tolerate difficult funding relationships, negotiations, and everything, but they created a lot of chain smokers, a lot of alcoholism amongst us, just dealing with grant proposals and reporting and everything. Now can you imagine what's going to happen when they skip you and they are now going to go to that last mile actor because they are unreformed. They want to bring the same instruments, the same compliance mechanism, the same thinking to that last mile person in a community and skip this different, this layer that is represented here, which to a large extent had served as a buffer. So to speak a little bit closer to your question, Murisa, the part of the shifts that we are seeing, and I think a lot of it is really from our advocates, because it's us who are sitting here who have talked about localization, it's us who have talked about long-term funding. And you start to hear that, but Evans and Tim are correct to say the infrastructure and the systems have not evolved at pace. Most of us are conditioned to project funding. We have no relationship whatsoever with wealth management, long-term stewardship of funds, for example. Because if you are now going to get long-term funding and it's now 8 years, 10 years, even longer, the mindset has to shift. The relationships you have, the phone numbers that you have on your Rolodex have to shift. You now need to have a relationship with a long-term finance manager who can help you preserve that wealth, manage that wealth, grow it even. So there are massive gaps that are represented in the infrastructure. Let me say one last thing and then shut up. It's about fiscal, the role of fiscal hosting. As this shift is happening, we are also seeing, especially because of the threats and the risks that are represented in the global north, particularly in the US, there is a massive search for people who can host funds, people who can safe house resources to some extent, but a lot of it is informed from the perspective of like these 4 years until Trump is out of office. And I want to make an argument that when the question that's posed before us here about, to think about the infrastructure, the systems, the institutions, we need to be thinking long term. We cannot be thinking about this infrastructure in expedient terms and very short term, what we can do to bypass the Trump administration. If we really are seeing the value of fiscal hosts today, we need to invest in them as part of the permanent and long-term infrastructure that will ensure that those who are on the last mile can have this buffer that can get them, help them to receive resources, and it goes beyond the different electoral cycles that we are trying to manage. I know we are short of time, so let me pause.
No, that's fantastic. You've already taken us to questions of infrastructure. But I think related to the question of infrastructure is location, because as we have heard from, especially from Brian and even Evans, capital by itself, by its very nature, is about power. So who controls it, where it's domiciled, those are all relationships with power. So Kadi, I know you want to add on to something, but as you are doing that, I want also to ask you a question to say, you are domiciled in the US. What would that look like if you were to shift your infrastructure here? Because you currently give an advantage to say organizations that are not 501c3, you can raise them, help them raise money, etc. But that risk, that compliance still stays in the US. Is that helping African organizations who are not yet invested or have not developed sort of those compliance capabilities to move? So we're trying to say that, I think, with the example of Trust Africa and many others, we've seen the shift that happens when you move to Africa and you make the argument that you have better understanding of the landscape, resources then are domiciled here. Is there still an advantage of being domiciled in the global north, yet you want to move resources into Africa?
Okay, so maybe let me contextualize a little bit what we actually do. I think it's important to understand that MIRA USA, like many intermediaries in the global north, and certainly in America, operate within a regulatory framework that is controlled by the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. So we actually have no power deciding where resources get moved. What we can do is ensuring that organizations that we host at MIRA USA for fundraising purposes, be they in Africa or in Europe or elsewhere, actually meet those requirements that the IRS has set aside, right? Like if you are fundraising for charitable purposes, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Our role is actually removing those legal barriers for organizations that are African-led. So to your question, we actually host many CBOs, African-based organizations that are fundraising in the US, and that normally wouldn't have access to those services because of all these perceived risk. We don't know what's gonna happen to money. These organizations are too small. So we have a variety of organizations that we work with. Some are super early stage and ranging from a budget of like 10K all the way to $10 million. So we're completely agnostic in terms of level of development. Our goal is to make sure that African-led organizations have access to fundraising markets in the United States. But we must do that within the compliance framework that's been set aside. So to answer your question, it's not a one-to-one. We cannot move Mirror USA compliance mechanism in Africa because Brian has said this earlier in his speech. We don't have the regulatory framework on the continent yet. And this is something that is quite sad, that you have countries overseas where African-led organizations have to go and reach for resources when our own countries are unable or maybe not interested yet in creating policies and compliance and regulatory frameworks that can help homegrown philanthropy to grow. So that's what we said.
I'm going to come back to you, Kadi, and I think it will be a tension in terms of a discussion with the BRICS around the regulatory framework across Africa. So just bear that in mind. Stephen, you train African organizations, help them raise resources. Is the end game about winning Western grants or about domestic resource mobilization?
Yes and no. It's about both. The general thesis of the New Africa Fund, coming from my own life experience of 20 years being part of, not to be hyperbolic, an abusive relationship between foreign funders and local African organizations before I was with the New Africa Fund, is about changing that. It is the source of my detest of project funding, because it is not about the projects, it is about controlling the agenda. It is that local organizations were and are an inexpensive means of implementation, not partners in setting what is the priorities in the communities where they live. And I didn't want to be a part of that. So we fund organizations. People ask, does the New Africa Fund fund health? This? No, we fund organizations. Whatever you are doing, if it is what your community needs, you can come to us and we can be part of that, with some exceptions. But that's our general thesis, is that the role of foreign funders is to see the capacity and the ability of organizations to properly deploy these funds, not to tell them how to do. I don't tell my organizations what to do with the money, they tell me what they did with the money. That's my compliance. At the end of the day, I'm the fiduciary for the New Africa Fund, so I do have to know what happened to the funds. But I don't live in their communities. They don't live in mine. I wouldn't expect them to fix the problems in my communities. I'm trying to teach them to be able to do what they're doing with an efficiency and an effectiveness and with a broader view. So to that end, are we trying to get them to completely go away from project funding? No. We're trying to make them equals. We all know what happened with USAID and what went after that. We all know organizations that folded. And we focus on the tragedy of what it is, communities in Africa. But it's a tragedy in a circle, because it's also funds that came from the public trust that are now wasted because these organizations were not sustainable and couldn't move past it. So the organizations died, the money was wasted, and the communities suffer. So in order to avoid that, we teach diversification, but in a concrete manner. We focus on small NGOs that have income-generating activities. And then we bring in small dollar donations from their own communities and their diaspora communities. And once you have 2/3 of your income that can't be affected by the political decisions that are occurring outside of your own environment, then go look for an EU grant. Go look for the UN, UNDP. We've all had to tighten our belts a third and survive. But if you ever have a situation where somebody else's agenda can destroy your work, then you shouldn't have been doing it in the first place. And that's the whole thesis of how this needs to change and why we do what we do.
Yeah, I just want to stay with you, Stephen, for a bit, because there are certain insights from your operations that you have learned operating across East Africa. Number one, the growth of the fund. Number two, the regulatory environment. How has that affected your work?
So I function under all of the same restrictions as a U.S. organization. We are a 501c3, but we are a public charity. 501c3 private foundations are only allowed to make distributions to other 501c3s. That's why we are a public charity, and that's why we take donations from outside of our core funders. It's extremely difficult, but we are constantly looking for ways to bring in efficiency for it. In fact, from here I'm flying back to Rwanda to finish our workshop with grantees, and then I'm flying to Kenya to sign the documents as we launch a Kenyan entity. And it's going to probably be in almost all the countries that we operate that we're going to need some sort of local entity just for banking purposes. As we invest, and again, we don't just give away money, we invest in the communities through recoverable grants, investments. I need a mechanism to get that money back. And if I have to send it out and in, the SWIFT, the correspondent banks, their 15% gets taken right off the top. So it's a complete challenge. And the speaker mentioned that the three kinds of entities that exist don't really match what we're trying to do. Because the charity model, the philanthropic model, was an imported model, largely from the United States, largely from the 19th century, when immigrants were coming in and there was no government, anything to help these communities. They turned into charities, and then we import this around the world. But in Africa, the systems exist to help your own communities. We're going to talk about funerals, and we talk about as our grantees. If you can find money for things like this, you can find money to keep girls in schools. That's the case for support that they're making to their supporters, and it's working. So it's difficult, but there are countries that recognize this, and they are trying to move forward with structures that would make our life and the lives of people trying to move capital in and around and across borders easier, but it's slow.
Infrastructure questions. These are very important. Thanks, Stephen, for that. Sam, just maybe to shift from infrastructure to talk about organizational power, where you sit, who makes the investment decision, who's in the room, and whose theory of change is working when you're beginning to deploy funds. So if the architecture is to be sort of African governed, does that require changing who sits on the investment committee? Does that require getting the people who benefit also coming into the room to make decisions?
I think one thing that capital allocators, especially from the West, have seen is it's shifting now, but there is a need for intellectual humility. And intellectual humility to understand that the person who's most proximate to the problem has the best solution. So as Steve has said, I think it's really important for us to support the local leaders and the proximate leaders and organizations who are building solutions that may not be articulate enough for the Harvard School of Business or the Yale School of Business. But
are there any Harvard scholars or not?
I'm sorry for the Harvard scholars. But it doesn't make sense in that room, but when you go to this person at the community level, it makes a lot of sense. And I think with that premise is how we have tried to adapt and build the capital support that supports organizations at that level. So for us, one thing I've seen also with organizations is if you're able to then, from that premise, give power to the local teams to actually make the investment decisions. So
these are locally?
Yes,
okay.
The local people make the investment decisions. And that does not mean that they don't need to go to an investment committee. They still need to be rigorous. They still need to evaluate their investment cases. But at that point, they're able to also bring in their own local perspectives. And I think that's one thing that has really transformed quite a bit of organizations to have the kind of impact that we are beginning to see right now.
Thanks for that. And in closing, Briggs, we'll come back and just do closing. But Briggs, if Trust Africa is a Pan-African organization, were resourced, blue sky vision, yeah? If you're resourced at 10 times what you currently have, what does that mean for the African-led architecture? Do we have capacity for that, to absorb that kind of money, and what needs to be done?
Yeah, so I'll give you figures again. Currently, Trust Africa is, we are moving $20 million annually. So if we are talking of 10 times, inshallah, that's $200 million. It really goes back to, because for us, and thanks Sam, the question of everything must start with proximate actors. Who is proximate to this? So it's not just a question of those who are closest to the issues have the greatest sense of the need, but it's also that they have the deepest accountability to the communities we are seeking to serve, and they have the greatest stake in the long-term outcomes. So everything revolves around that. And I would say even if we were to scale to $200 million annually, it's really about what infrastructure, what kind of ecosystem do you need to be able to deploy that with the most proximate actor in mind. Sure. And again, the issues that we brought earlier, shifting our thinking from project financing, managing project funds, to actually managing funds long term. Sure. Shifting who is in our contact list to now include wealth managers, because we are now thinking about long term, yes, and we are holding these resources in the long term. Becomes something that's very important.
Holding them in the continent.
Holding them in continent, not just in continent, but at our institutions. Like we need to be resourcing movements with 10 years, 15 years funding. And I would say something even more than that. Our own movements need to start to even think about endowments beyond just saving accounts. We need to actually start to think about what does setting up endowments begin to look like. So the shift that is happening really calls on us to also shift our thinking to that next level. And I wanted to say something else, Murisa, and say there's a big tendency that we probably have not paid attention to so far, which is around this justice-led potential shifts in funding flows. There's massive traction that is happening on reparations, for example, right now. There's massive traction that is happening on work to curb illicit financial flows. Massive traction that is happening on work around debt, sovereignty, debt management. And I don't think we need to wait until the results we are pushing there happens before we start to imagine the infrastructure and the institutions and the systems that we need to capture those resources. If anyone here knows about BMW Foundation, they were created from similar processes when people looked at how do we redeploy the finances that had been accumulated through some of the completely unconscionable practices by the Nazi regimes. So the same way we're thinking about IFFs, about debt, about reparations, we also need to imagine these as new forms of funding flows that we need to start to think about and to prepare about. And I think for Trust Africa, those are the kind of things that we'll be really interested in investing around.
All right, colleagues, time is really gone. So if you want to say anything, you could see Irungu walking up to me. It was literally like, shut up now. 30 seconds, just closing remarks, 30 seconds, and we got off, because we are the ones blocking people from having their tea. Just 30 seconds, Kadi, I'll start with you.
Just quickly underscoring the need to build endowment. Absolutely. I mean, global philanthropy is structured in such a way right now where many African-led organizations are depending on revenue-based fundraising. Even if it's unrestricted, it's every year you have to keep doing that. So I think endowment is absolutely spot on. The other thing that I want to underscore that I wish we had spent more time speaking about is diaspora funding, diaspora philanthropy, or however you want to call that. I think it's very important to clarify what we mean by this $100 billion in remittances. There is emergency cash, household consumption that Sam has mentioned. We need to go beyond that and then look at diaspora funding as investment. So just wanted to underscore.
Thanks, Kadi.
This word, don't lose hope. I work with so many young, energetic, intelligent African founders of NGOs and social enterprises who impress me beyond compare. They are finding creative solutions to things that problems you didn't even know existed. If we create the mechanisms and the infrastructure for them to thrive, the future will be bright.
Fantastic.
I think for me, it's continue to support proximate leadership and proximate organizations. But another thing is, in almost every conference that we've been going to, collaboration comes out as a theme and as an exciting thing. But no one funds collaboration. Funding collaboration means there is headcount, there is funding of people coming together, but no one funds it. And we all come out inspired. So I think let's also endeavor to fund collaboration. And yeah, I think those are my points.
Briggs, strictly 30 seconds.
Yeah, my last word is really whether funding is strengthening African agents. Let's keep an eye on that. I think that's the most strategic question before us.
A round of applause for the experts in the room. Thank you so much, colleagues.